She was sold on a Tuesday morning. Between breakfast and the dressmaker's appointment, her stepmother never intended to keep. No ceremony, no tenderness. Just a number written on parchment, her bride price, passed across a mahogany desk while Vivian stood in the doorway, still holding a book she'd never finish. Duke Alaric Blackthorne didn't even look up. He simply signed his name, folded the document, and slid it into his coat pocket like a receipt for something ordinary. A horse. A parcel of land. A girl nobody wanted. What nobody in that room understood, what she didn't understand, was that the most dangerous man in England had just done the one thing he'd spent a decade trying never to do. He'd let her get close enough to save. Part 1. The Price of a Girl. Nobody wanted. The morning they told Vivian she was to be married, it had been raining for 3 days straight. Not the soft, romantic kind of rain that made the gardens of Ashford Manor look like something painted by a Flemish master. This was the ugly kind, the kind that turned the gravel paths to gray slurry, that seeped under the windowsills and made the east wing smell like rotting wood and old grief. The kind of rain that felt personal, like the sky had an opinion about what was happening inside the house and had decided to register its displeasure in the most miserable way possible. Vivian had been in the library since before dawn. She hadn't slept. This wasn't unusual. Sleep had become a complicated negotiation over the past 2 years since her mother's death had rearranged the architecture of her life so thoroughly that she sometimes walked through rooms she'd known since childhood and felt like a stranger in them. The library was the one exception. Her mother had built it, shelf by shelf, book by book, dragging volumes home from London and Edinburgh, and once, memorably, from a bookseller in Paris, who'd wrapped each one in brown paper and tied them with red string. The smell of the room, old paper, linseed oil, a faint ghost of the jasmine her mother had kept in a vase on the reading desk, was the closest thing Vivian had to a place that still felt like hers. She was reading Montaigne when the door opened without a knock. She didn't look up. She'd learned, in the years since Lady Harriet Ashford had moved herself and her 2 daughters into the manor and rearranged its furniture and its hierarchy with equal efficiency, that looking up was a form of invitation. If you didn't look up, sometimes they went away. Sometimes you could buy yourself another 10 minutes inside the only space where no one could make you feel like a debt that hadn't been paid. You're not dressed. Lady Harriet's voice had a particular quality that Vivian had spent 2 years cataloging. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the texture of a blade being drawn slowly across stone. Patient, purposeful, the sound of something being sharpened for use. I wasn't aware I needed to be, Vivian said, turning a page she hadn't actually read. The footsteps crossed the room. Vivian kept her eyes on the page. She could track Harriet's position by sound alone now. The particular rhythm of her heels on hardwood, the slight pause that meant she was surveying something and calculating what it said about her own authority. Put the book down, Vivian. She put the book down. Not because she was afraid exactly. She'd moved past afraid somewhere around the 6th month after her father's remarriage, when Harriet had quietly dismissed her mother's personal maid and replaced her with a woman who reported everything Vivian said and did in detail. What she felt now was something colder and more functional than fear. It was the particular vigilance of someone who has learned that the floor might give way at any moment and has simply decided to stop being surprised by it. Harriet was wearing gray. She always wore gray or black or the kind of deep blue that functioned socially as a kind of gray, colors that communicated seriousness without sacrificing elegance. She was a handsome woman in the way that certain pieces of expensive furniture were handsome, well constructed, precisely maintained, and entirely without warmth. She was holding a letter. Your father received a correspondence yesterday evening, Harriet said. She set the letter on the reading desk beside Montaigne, not offering it, just placing it there like evidence. From the Duke of Blackthorne. Vivian looked at the letter. The seal was black wax, pressed with a crest she didn't recognize, something angular and heraldic, the kind of design that had been commissioned to communicate a specific message about the family that used it. Power. Permanence. The complete absence of apology. I don't understand, Vivian said, though some instinct in her stomach was already assembling a picture she didn't want to see finished. You're not required to understand, Harriet said pleasantly. You're required to be ready by Thursday. The Duke has requested a formal introduction at Thornfield House. His solicitor will be present. Your father's solicitor will be present. She paused, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve. The terms have already been agreed. The rain hit the windows. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. What terms? Vivienne said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of someone watching the floor give way in slow motion, unable to do anything except observe the physics of the collapse. Harriet looked at her with the expression she reserved for Vivienne specifically, a look that managed to communicate both contempt and total indifference, as though Vivienne were a minor inconvenience that had finally organized itself into a useful form. Marriage terms, obviously. The Duke has been considering remarriage for some time. Your father has agreed to the match. My father. Vivienne said the words carefully, the way you'd handle a thing you weren't sure was stable. My father agreed. Don't do that thing with your voice, Harriet said, turning toward the door. It's unbecoming. You should be grateful. Duke Blackthorne is one of the most powerful men in England. This is a significant elevation for someone in your position. My position. Harriet stopped at the door and turned, and for just a moment the pleasantness dropped. Not into cruelty exactly, but into something more honest. Something that looked briefly like the raw transaction it was. You have no dowry, Vivienne. You have no social standing that your father hasn't borrowed from my name. You have no accomplishments that society considers relevant, and you are 22 years old, which, in case you failed to notice, is not a young woman's most marriageable age in our circles. She picked up the pleasant expression again, settling it back into place the way you'd rehang a painting. The Duke is 61. He's been widowed once. His previous engagement ended in tragedy. There are rumors about his bloodline that I won't repeat, and society considers him, at best, a complicated prospect. But he is wealthy enough to resolve several problems simultaneously, and he has expressed a specific interest in you. Why? Vivienne said. Why me specifically? Something moved across Harriet's face that wasn't quite a smile. I'm sure I have no idea, she said. Thursday, Vivienne, be ready. The door closed without a sound. Vivienne sat in the library for a long time after that. The rain kept going. Montaigne lay open on the desk, and she looked at the page she hadn't read, and the words blurred in a way that had nothing to do with her eyes. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried since the night they'd lowered her mother into the ground in the Ashford family plot, with the rain doing essentially what it was doing now, registering its opinion, and Harriet standing 3 feet to her right looking at the casket with the expression of someone mentally rearranging furniture. She was doing arithmetic, was all. The cold, necessary kind, the kind her mother had taught her without using that word for it. The survival math of women who understand that the world is built by people who rarely consult the women whose lives it shapes. The numbers came out the same every way she ran them. She had no money of her own. Her father's estate, which had once been her mother's estate, which had once been her grandfather's estate, built over 3 generations of careful management and genuine love for the land, had been methodically leveraged against itself in the 2 years since her mother's death. She knew this not because anyone had told her, no one told her anything, but because she had spent 2 years watching and listening with the particular attention of someone who understands that information is the only currency available to the powerless. Harriet was moving money. Quietly, efficiently, the way she did everything. Vivienne's inheritance, the portion specified in her mother's original will, the one that predated her father's remarriage and its various legal adjustments, was being eroded. She didn't have the documents to prove it. She didn't have the legal standing to act on it, even if she did. She was a woman in England in 1887, and that meant the architecture of the law was built around her absence as a legal subject. She was being sold. She understood this with the same clarity she'd understood, at 14, that the horse her father had bought her was not actually her horse. It belonged to the estate, which meant it belonged, ultimately, to whoever managed the estate, which would not be her. The only question was whether Duke Alaric Blackthorne was the kind of disaster she couldn't survive, or the kind she could. She opened the letter. The handwriting was not what she'd expected. She'd imagined something autocratic, thick strokes, the penmanship of a man who wrote orders and expected them followed. What she found instead was a hand that was precise without being rigid, controlled in a way that suggested the control was a choice rather than a compulsion. The words were formal, the language of legal correspondence. But there was something in the construction of certain sentences, a compression, a careful selection, that felt like a mind being deliberately economic with itself. I wasn't performing power on the page. He already had it. He didn't need to perform anything. There was a line near the bottom of the second page that she read 3 times. Miss Ashford will be well treated in all things. I do not require her to pretend contentment she does not feel. I require only honesty and the basic dignity of mutual respect. Everything else is negotiable." She folded the letter and put it in her pocket, which was the same thing she did with any object she wanted to keep safe, hidden, close, portable. She didn't know what to do with that line, so she kept it close and waited to see what it turned into. Thursday arrived in the way bad things always arrived, faster than reason suggested it should, as though time had a vested interest in getting you to the appointment before you'd finished preparing your defenses. They put her in the blue dress. Not the good one. Harriet's older daughter, Cecily, had been wearing the good one at every significant social occasion for the past 18 months. A quiet appropriation of Vivian's wardrobe that proceeded on the assumption that Vivian had no use for quality clothing since she was going nowhere. The one they gave her was acceptable. Navy, well cut, showing no visible wear. It communicated daughter of a respectable house without communicating bride of consequence, which Vivian suspected was intentional. She didn't argue. She had learned early that the energy spent arguing with Harriet about material things, clothing, rooms, access to the accounts, was energy that didn't go toward the internal architecture she was building, the mental rooms where she kept what was actually hers. The carriage ride to Thornfield House took 40 minutes. She spent it looking out the window at the wet countryside and thinking about Duke Alaric Blackthorne. She'd done her research, which had involved bribing one of the younger footmen with access to her father's study and a subscription to 3 London newspapers, and spending an evening in the library reading everything she could find. The story that emerged was not comforting. I was 61, as Harriet had said. His first wife, Lady Margaret Holt, had died 14 years ago of a fever that the newspapers described vaguely, and his acquaintances described not at all. The kind of social silence that meant either profound grief or something people had agreed, collectively, not to discuss. His subsequent engagement to Lady Priscilla Vane had ended 17 months later when Lady Priscilla had died falling from the upper gallery of Blackthorne Castle, an accident that 3 separate newspapers had investigated, and one had implied was not an accident before issuing a retraction 6 days later. The retraction was notable for what it didn't say. It said the paper had no evidence of wrongdoing. It did not say the paper believed there had been no wrongdoing. After that, society had begun constructing the Duke of Blackthorne in the way society always constructed men. It couldn't fully explain, from the fragments of truth it had and the architecture of rumor it built to fill the gaps. The result was a figure who occupied the specific space in the English aristocracy reserved for men who were powerful enough that their social danger was itself a form of social currency. People talked about him constantly. No one talked to him if they could avoid it. The bloodline curse was the most popular story. The details varied depending on who was telling it, but the central claim was consistent. The Blackthorne line was burdened with some hereditary condition. Some whispered it was madness. Others said it was more specific, a physical incapacity that meant the Duke could not father children. The estate and the title would die with him. Vivian had sat with that specific fact for a long time. She was 22. The only thing society valued her for, the thing every aristocratic marriage was fundamentally structured around, was her capacity to produce heirs. If the Duke could not father children, then that currency was irrelevant, which meant whatever he was paying for, whatever Harriet had negotiated across that mahogany desk, it was something else. Something Vivian didn't have a name for yet. The carriage stopped. Thornfield House was the kind of building designed to communicate a specific and deliberate message about its owner. Not beautiful, or rather, not beauty as its primary register. It was imposing in the way that mountains were imposing, the architectural equivalent of something that had always been there and intended to continue being there after everything else had crumbled. Stone, gray and enormous, with windows that seemed too small for the scale of the walls, like eyes that gave away nothing. Vivian stepped out of the carriage and looked up at it and felt, with absolute clarity, the way a small creature must feel standing at the entrance to a cave it hasn't decided to enter yet. Her father took her arm. She led him. He was not a bad man, her father. This was the most complicated fact of her life. He was weak in the specific way that kind men with inadequate spines were weak, incapable of cruelty himself, capable of allowing it in others through the same structural failure. He'd loved her mother. He'd been lost without her. He'd married Harriet because Harriet had organized his grief into forward motion, and he'd never interrogated the price of that service clearly enough to understand what it had cost. "Vivian," he said, as they walked toward the entrance. His voice had the quality it always had when he was about to say something he knew was inadequate. "The Duke is a good man. I believe that." She didn't answer. She put one foot in front of the other, which was all the philosophy she had room for at the moment. The meeting room at Thornfield House smelled like old wood and something metallic. Not blood, but the memory of old fires, of rooms where serious men had made decisions for centuries. The furniture was heavy and expensive without being ornate, the kind of taste that came from people who'd had money long enough to lose the need to prove it. Duke Alaric Blackthorne was standing at the far end of the room. Vivian had prepared herself for old. She had not prepared herself for this. I was tall, not unusually so, but with the specific quality of height that came from bearing, from the way a body organized itself in a room, as though the room had been designed around it. His hair was silver white, the kind that had been dark once and aged completely rather than partially, which gave his face a contrast that was startling in person. He was broader across the shoulders than she'd expected for a man of 61. The lines of his face were deep, not the soft creasing of comfortable age, but the carved kind, the kind you got from weather and tension and decades of keeping an expression that gave nothing away for free. He looked at her when she entered. Not the cursory social glance she'd anticipated, the brief visual inventory that men of his position performed as a matter of social mechanics, assessing a woman the way you'd assess a horse or a piece of property, noting quality without engaging attention. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's been thinking about for a very long time, completely, without apology, like recognition. It lasted approximately 3 seconds before he looked away, but 3 seconds was long enough to notice. The solicitors were present, 2 men in identical dark coats, with the identical careful blankness of professionals paid to witness things without remembering them. And Harriet was seated to the right, straight-backed and still as architecture. Her father was beside her. Cecily was not there, which was a small mercy. Miss Ashford. The Duke's voice was not what she'd expected, lower than the space suggested, controlled in a way that sounded like practice rather than nature, like a man who had learned to manage the volume and temperature of his own voice as a deliberate tool. "Please sit down." She sat. The chair across the desk from him, which she suspected had been positioned to create a specific dynamic, the formal distance of a transaction, felt suddenly like the loneliest piece of furniture in England. "I trust the journey was acceptable." "The roads are poor from the rain," she said, but the carriage was adequate. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the ghost of an expression that had decided at the last moment not to fully arrive. The solicitors began to speak. Vivian listened to the language of legal documents, terms, conditions, provisions, the architectural vocabulary of a life being formally reorganized, and watched the Duke's face, which was the most controlled face she had ever seen on a living human being. He signed things when the solicitors placed them in front of him. He spoke when spoken to directly. He was formal and absolutely precise, and she could not read him at all, which was unusual. She had learned to read people the way you learn to read weather, out of necessity, because knowing what was coming was the only way to prepare for it. I was opaque. Not cold, Ma. She was watching carefully enough to notice the difference. A cold person had a specific quality of absence, like a room with no fire. He wasn't absent. He was present in the way that very dangerous or very careful things were present. Dense, complete, taking up more space than his physical dimensions accounted for. When the solicitors finished, Harriet stood and performed what Vivian recognized as her social summary voice, the register she used to close negotiations by framing them as settled matters of mutual benefit. Something about the honor of the families, the appropriateness of the match. "Yes," the Duke said, in a way that stopped Harriet mid-sentence with the efficiency of a closed door. He was looking at Vivian. "I'd like a few minutes with Miss Ashford," he said, "alone." Harriet's face performed its version of composure. "That would be somewhat irregular." "Yes," he said again, identically, the same weight, the same complete absence of negotiation in the syllable. Harriet looked at Vivian's father. Her father looked at his hands. The solicitors gathered their papers with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned to leave rooms when rooms required emptying. The door closed behind all of them. Vivian sat in the silence and waited, because waiting was what she had. The Duke moved to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment, not dramatically, not in the way of a man performing thought, but with the quality of someone giving himself the 30 seconds his particular discipline required before speaking. "You don't want this," he said, without turning. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. He turned. "You're not afraid to say so." "Would it change anything if I were afraid to say so?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has asked a question they already knew the answer to and wanted to confirm it. "No," he said, "it wouldn't." "Then being afraid to say so would only be inefficient," Vivian said. The ghost of that expression came back to the corner of his mouth, more substantial this time. She still couldn't classify it. He came back to the desk but didn't sit, stood on his side of it, one hand resting flat on the surface, which was the posture of a man who'd made thousands of decisions at thousands of desks, and had some relationship with them that was different from the relationship he had with chairs. "I want to tell you 3 things," he said, "and I'd like you to hear them before you decide what I am." Vivian put her hands in her lap. "All right. The first, I am not marrying you to have an heir. The stories about my bloodline are," a pause, precise and deliberate, "substantially accurate. I will never have children. This is not something I require from this arrangement." She looked at him steadily. "Then what do you require?" "The second thing." He didn't answer her question directly, which she noted. "You will be mistress of Blackthorn Castle, with all the authority and resources that entails. You will not be managed, instructed in your social behavior, or monitored. Your household will be your own to run as you see fit. I am gone 3 months of every year on estate business in Scotland and Ireland. When I am absent, the house and lands are entirely under your direction." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "And the third?" Something changed in his face then, barely perceptible, the kind of change that only registered because she'd been watching him with such attention. A slight shift in the line of his jaw. A quality in his eyes that was different from the controlled opacity of the previous hour. "Your mother was Catherine Pemberton before she married your father," he said. "Her estate at Aldermere was left to you in her original will. A specific inheritance, protected by a trust her father established before his own death. That trust was supposed to be legally unreachable." The room went very still. "Supposed to be," Vivian said carefully. "3 months ago," the Duke said, "Lady Harriet Ashford's solicitor filed paperwork to have that trust dissolved on the grounds of administrative irregularity. The paperwork is fraudulent. The signatures on 2 key documents are forged." He paused. "I became aware of this 6 weeks ago." Vivian heard her own heartbeat. "How?" "Because I have been watching your family's legal situation for some time," he said, without inflection. "Vivian." He said her name for the first time, not Miss Ashford, her name, and the quality of it in his voice was something she couldn't immediately account for. "Your mother's estate is worth approximately £40,000 in current valuation. If that trust is dissolved, that money goes directly to Lady Harriet. It is almost certainly the primary purpose of this entire marriage arrangement, to bring you under a legal umbrella that makes it easier to complete the transfer." She stood up. She hadn't planned to. Her body simply made the decision without consulting the part of her brain that was still trying to process the information. And she was on her feet, and the chair was behind her, and she was looking at the Duke with something in her chest that wasn't any single emotion she had a name for, but was all of them compressed into something with significant pressure. "You're telling me," she said with great care, "that Harriet arranged this marriage, that she found you, or perhaps that's not the right order. Did she come to you, or did you—" "I approached your father," the Duke said, "through intermediaries. Lady Harriet redirected the correspondence to herself and managed the negotiations. She believes she orchestrated the match. She did not." The silence was enormous. "Why?" Vivian said. The word came out with more rawness than she'd intended. Not a social question, but a genuine one. The kind that came from the part of her that had been asking it in different forms for 2 years, every time she looked in the mirror in a house that used to be her mother's house, and felt like a ghost in it. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was the most human thing she'd seen on his face, something that had the texture of an old wound that had healed badly, but healed. "Because," he said, "I have known since you were 17 years old what kind of person you are, and I am 61 years old, and I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who want things from me, and I have become—" a pause. "Very good at identifying the people who don't." Vivian stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "We have met once. We are meeting now." I know what I observed, he said. At the Ashfield Royal Gathering in 1882, you were 17. There was a girl, one of the servants' daughters, not a guest. She'd come in through the garden and gotten confused about where she was and started crying in the east corridor. Everyone who walked past her kept walking. You were the only person who stopped. You sat down on the floor next to her in a dress that cost more than her father made in a year, and you stayed until she stopped crying, and then you walked her to the kitchen entrance yourself. The room was very quiet. You didn't know anyone was watching, he said. Vivian couldn't find language for what was happening in her chest. She had completely forgotten that afternoon. She had forgotten it the way you forgot things that felt like the obvious minimum of human behavior. The things you did not because they were extraordinary, but because the alternative was unthinkable. She started. I'm not telling you this to be romantic, the Duke said, with the specific precision of a man closing off a misinterpretation before it could fully form. I'm telling you because you asked why. That's why. You were someone who sat down on the floor with a crying child when no one was watching. I have been waiting for a version of the world where I could do something useful with that observation. She was standing in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides, and everything she'd prepared to feel about this meeting, the resignation, the cold arithmetic of survival, the managed distance she'd been building for 2 days, had been completely disorganized by a conversation she hadn't anticipated. What do you actually want from me? She said. Honestly, not the legal language, not the terms. What do you actually want? He held her gaze for a moment that felt like a test of something, though she wasn't sure what was being tested. To make sure, he said, that someone like you has a door to walk through that isn't chosen for them by someone like Harriet Ashford. It was not a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was something harder and less comfortable than either of those things. It was simply a statement of intent, delivered with the same precision he applied to everything else. She thought about £40,000, about her mother's name on a trust document, about forged signatures and a marriage arrangement that had been constructed around her like a cage that called itself a contract. She thought about a girl on a floor in an east corridor in 1882 whom she'd completely forgotten, and a man 61 years old who apparently hadn't. Thursday, she said finally. You said the introduction was Thursday. It is Thursday, he said, with the ghost of that expression again. She looked at him. This was the introduction then. This was the introduction, he confirmed. She picked up her gloves from the desk where she'd set them down. At some point she couldn't remember. She put them on with great attention because her hands needed something to do that wasn't visible. All right, she said. He didn't ask her what that meant, which was either because he already knew or because he understood that she herself wasn't entirely sure yet. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle because there was one more question and she was going to ask it now, in this room, before the solicitors and Harriet and her father came back in and the room filled up with other people's needs again. Your first wife, she said without turning, and Lady Priscilla Vane. The silence behind her had a specific quality. My wife, he said, died of a fever. It was a terrible and ordinary tragedy. A pause. Priscilla Vane was in love with a man her family would never have permitted her to marry. I provided a useful problem for her. She staged the accident. She is currently living in Portugal with the man she loved, under a different name. Another pause, shorter. I have never told anyone that. Vivian stood at the door. Why are you telling me? She said. Because you asked, he said. And I told you, I require honesty and basic dignity. Those go in both directions. She opened the door. The hallway beyond it was full of people waiting, solicitors, her father, Harriet, with her expression of careful social management already assembled and ready for deployment. They looked at Vivian with the various calculations she was used to reading on the faces of people who had organized her life into a resource. She walked through them. She did not look back at the Duke, though she was aware of him behind her the way you were aware of things that took up more space than their dimensions accounted for. The wedding was scheduled for 4 weeks later. Those 4 weeks passed in the way that waiting always passed when you'd made a decision but hadn't yet arrived at its consequences, in fragments, in ordinary details that felt strange in retrospect, in the accumulated weight of small moments that turned out to matter. Harriet was satisfied. This was the most nauseating development of the interim period, watching her stepmother's satisfaction at what she believed she'd arranged. Harriet moved through the house in the weeks before the wedding with the quality of a person who has completed a complex piece of work and is now waiting for the payment to clear. She was almost pleasant, in the way that made the pleasantness feel like an insult. She asked Vivian twice about her preferences for the wedding dress, which was twice more than she had ever asked about any of Vivian's preferences for anything. Vivian answered in complete sentences and watched Harriet process those answers with the particular attention of someone who is building a mental model she intends to use. She received one more communication from the Duke in that period. A single letter, shorter than the first, with no salutation. The documents regarding the Aldermere Trust have been secured. They are in my solicitor's safe. If you require them before the wedding for any purpose, send word through the bearer of this letter and they will be provided. They will not be used without your knowledge or your direction. A.B. She read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the same pocket where she'd put the first one. She thought about what it meant that he'd said your direction. Not my direction. With your permission or in your name. Your direction. The distinction was so precise it almost felt like a language he'd invented specifically to communicate something he didn't have ordinary words for. She began, very cautiously, and with the specific vigilance of someone who has learned that floors give way without warning, to entertain the possibility that she'd gotten the arithmetic completely wrong. The wedding day was clear and cold, which felt honest in a way she appreciated. She stood in the church in the dress she'd chosen herself. Harriet had intended to choose it, but Vivian had arrived at the dressmaker 40 minutes before Harriet and had very quietly made a different set of decisions, and looked at the man waiting for her at the altar, and did the arithmetic one more time. He looked the same as he had at Thornfield House. He would always look the same, she suspected, not because he was unchanging, but because the way he organized himself in space was consistent, the result of decisions he'd made at some point in his life, and stuck to regardless of circumstance. I was watching the door when she entered, and when their eyes met, the recognition was there again. That quality of a man looking at something he'd been thinking about for a very long time. She walked toward him. The ceremony was traditional and formal, and she was not fully present for most of it, occupying the mental space she used when she needed to let her surface self manage a situation, while the deeper self did something more important. The thing her deeper self was doing was watching Harriet. Harriet stood in the front pew with the expression of a person whose plan is executing perfectly, and Vivian watched her with the particular attention of someone who knows something the other person doesn't know they know. When the Duke said "I do," his voice had the same quality it had when he'd said yes to stop Harriet in mid-sentence at Thornfield House, complete, unhurried, without any of the performed weight that people sometimes put into words they weren't sure of. When Vivian said "I do," she was looking at him. She was not performing anything. The reception was a performance in 4 acts. The guests were the specific selection of English aristocracy that attended these events out of social obligation and the particular human appetite for witnessing things that might be talked about later. Men in tailcoats who'd known the Duke for decades and women in their best dresses who'd spent the carriage ride over reviewing what they knew about the rumors, ready to update their models based on whatever they observed. Vivian observed all of them observing her and made mental notes with the efficiency she'd developed over years of being in rooms where she was the subject of the analysis rather than the analyst. She was standing near the window at the far end of the reception room when Cecily found her. Her stepsister was 17 and had the specific quality of a very pretty young woman who had been told she was very pretty in the particular way that makes the information feel like both a gift and a weapon. She was wearing yellow, which suited her, and her expression as she approached was the one Vivian had catalogued as performing casualness while actually executing a specific social task. "So," Cecily said, with the brightness of someone who's decided not to be direct about what they're being direct about. "How does it feel to be Duchess of Blackthorn?" "Strange," Vivian said honestly. "I haven't had it long enough to know." Cecily was quiet for a moment, and then something slipped in her expression. Not much, but enough to be visible to someone who'd been watching this face for 2 years. Something that looked, briefly, less like performance and more like the actual thing underneath. "Are you frightened of him?" she said in a lower voice. Vivian looked at her stepsister with genuine attention for perhaps the first time. The question had come from somewhere different than the performance. Cecily was 17 and had been prepared for a society marriage since the age of 14, and maybe this was what that preparation looked like from the inside. Not ambition, but the specific fear of someone who understood, with the clarity of youth, what being sold actually meant, even when it was being sold upward. "No," Vivian said. I don't think so. Cicely looked at her for a moment, and then the performance reassembled itself. She said something about the flowers and moved away into the crowd, and Vivian watched her go and thought about the arithmetic of women's lives and how the numbers came out differently, depending on which tools you'd been given to do the calculation. So it was after 11 when the last carriage took the last guests away. The house they were staying in, a Blackthorn property in the city, before the journey north to the castle, went quiet in the way large houses went quiet after large events. Not silence exactly, but the accumulated absence of noise, the particular absence that reminded you of everything that had been filling the space before. Vivian was still dressed. She was at the window of the room she'd been assigned, separate from the Duke's, which was either courtesy or distance or both, looking at the dark street below and running the day through her head the way she did with everything, sorting it into categories. She heard the knock at her door. Come in, she said without turning. The Duke entered. He'd removed his coat. He was still formal in the sense that everything about him was organized and intentional, but without the coat there was something different in the quality of his presence. Slightly less armored, she thought. Slightly more the man and less the social construction. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and looked at her at the window. I wanted to tell you something, he said. Before tomorrow. She turned. All right. Harriet's solicitor made a second filing last week, he said. Not the one we discussed, a new one. He accessed the Aldermere Trust documentation through a channel we hadn't secured. Vivian was very still. There's a new document in the filing, he continued. A letter, purportedly from your mother, written several months before her death. It contradicts the terms of the trust. It states that she intended her estate to pass to your father, not directly to you. The cold in Vivian's chest was the kind that didn't have a temperature. It was the recognition of a pattern, the particular pattern of being outmaneuvered, of watching the floor give way again, of understanding that the people doing this to her were not finished, had never been finished, would keep going because stopping was never what they'd planned. Is it authentic? She said. No, he said. It was written approximately 3 weeks ago, based on the paper and ink. But authenticating that will take time, and Harriet's solicitor knows it takes time, which is why he filed it now. He paused. This is not something I can resolve before tomorrow, Vivian. It's going to take several weeks. I want you to understand that. She looked at him across the room. You're telling me, she said slowly, that the thing you said was secured is not secured. I'm telling you that your stepmother is more resourceful than I anticipated, he said, without flinching from the accountability of that, and that I underestimated her timeline. Yes. The room was quiet. What does she need the money for? Vivian said. Not angry yet. Something before anger, the cold clarity of a person who has decided that emotion is a resource to be managed. If it's £40,000, there must be a specific debt or obligation driving the timeline. Something shifted in the Duke's face. I have a theory, he said carefully. Tell me. He looked at her for a moment that felt like another test of the same caliber as the one in Thornfield House. Your father, he said, has been investing in an enterprise that is, in my estimation, approximately 6 months from being exposed as entirely fraudulent. He doesn't know this. He believes he has tripled his investment. In fact, he has lost the original capital. And when the enterprise collapses, he will be liable for additional debts he has not accounted for. The total exposure is, he paused, close to £60,000. Vivian heard this information arrive in the particular silence of something that rearranged everything around it. Harriet knows, she said. I believe she has known for some time, he said. Yes. She needed my inheritance to cover it, Vivian said, before it collapsed, before the timeline ran out. That is my theory. She turned back to the window. The dark street below was entirely indifferent to all of it, which she found, obscurely, comforting. The street would be here tomorrow and the next day, and it didn't have any opinions about the financial architecture of her stepmother's schemes or the legal vulnerability of her dead mother's estate. How long, she said. For the document to be authenticated and the filing challenged? Yes, 6 to 8 weeks, he said. Possibly longer, depending on the courts. 6 to 8 weeks. This enterprise her father had invested in had 6 months before it collapsed. Harriet had 6 months to get the money. The arithmetic arranged itself with the clean, horrible clarity of a trap snapping shut. She's going to keep going, Vivian said. Whatever you secure, she's going to find another angle. Yes, he said. I expect she will. She turned from the window and looked at him. At the man she'd married 6 hours ago, standing in her doorway at 11 at night, telling her that the situation he'd promised to help her with was more complicated than he'd accounted for. He had the expression of a man who had made a commitment and was now looking at a version of it he hadn't fully mapped in advance, and who had decided, apparently, that honesty was more important than managing her impression of his competence. She didn't know what to do with that. She'd been managed her entire adult life by people who controlled information as a way of controlling her. Being given the information, the unmediated, unmanaged, complicated truth of it, was something she didn't have a vocabulary for yet. All right, she said. He looked at her. We should sleep, she said. Tomorrow is a long journey. We can plan properly when we're at the castle, and I can look at the actual documents. I was quiet for a moment. You want to look at the actual documents? Of course I want to look at the actual documents, she said. You said your direction. That was the word you used. My direction. He looked at her with the expression that had been cycling through variations all day. The one she still couldn't fully classify. The one that had the texture of something very old and very carefully kept. Yes, he said. I did say that. Then I need to see the documents, she said. All of them. Everything you have, not summaries, not your solicitor's assessment, the original documents. I'll have them ready when we arrive, he said. She nodded. He moved to leave, and she turned back to the window, and the street below remained indifferent, and she thought about her mother's estate and £40,000, and a fraudulent letter written 3 weeks ago on paper that wasn't old enough. Alaric, she said. He stopped at the door. She'd used his name for the first time. Not the title, the name, and the fact that she'd done it without planning to was information about something she didn't want to look at too directly yet. The letter they forged, she said. My mother's handwriting. It would have to be convincing enough to survive a preliminary review. It is, he said. It's very good. Who wrote it? She said. The silence behind her had that specific quality again. I have a name, he said. I've had it for 3 days. She turned. His expression was the most open it had been all day. Something underneath the controlled surface that was available in a way the rest of him hadn't been. Something that looked like the specific anger of a man who has identified precisely where the damage was done and is deciding what to do with that precision. Tell me, she said. He told her. And that was when the night cracked open. Because the name he spoke was not a stranger's name. It was not Harriet's solicitor. It was not some hired hand, some anonymous instrument of her stepmother's scheme. It was someone Vivian had trusted completely. Someone who had access to things no outside party should have had access to. Someone who had been inside the grief of her mother's death and used it as a door. The name hung in the room between them. And outside, the street remained dark and indifferent. And somewhere north of them, Blackthorn Castle waited in its cold hills, holding secrets in its stone that neither of them had yet learned to read. And the floor, which Vivian had always known could give way without warning, gave way in a direction she had never seen coming. The name was Thomas Ellery. Vivian stood in the middle of the room and heard it and felt the specific physical sensation of something structural giving way. Not in her knees, not anywhere dramatic, but somewhere in the chest, in the place where you kept the things you'd decided were safe. Thomas Ellery had been her mother's solicitor for 11 years. He had sat at her mother's bedside in the final weeks, holding documents and holding his hat and doing the patient, decent work of a man helping a dying woman put her affairs in order. He had been at the funeral. He had shaken Vivian's hand and told her that her mother had been the finest client he'd ever represented, and his voice had broken slightly, and Vivian had believed it because she'd been 20 years old and her mother was 3 days in the ground, and she hadn't yet understood that grief was also a tool. She understood now. How long? She said. The question came out flat, stripped of everything except the information it was asking for. Alaric was watching her with the specific quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, unrushed, the attention of a man who understood that the most important data in a room was rarely the data people were speaking aloud. I believe he was approached within 6 months of your mother's death, he said. The first irregularities in the trust documentation appear approximately 8 months after the funeral. 8 months. She'd been sitting in the library reading Montaigne while Thomas Ellery was rewriting her mother's intentions on paper that hadn't aged yet. He had everything, she said. Her signature, her legal language, the way she structured her sentences. She stopped, started again. She trusted him. Yes. She trusted him, and he... She stopped again. She was not going to cry in front of this man she'd known for 6 hours. That was not a rule she'd announced to herself. It didn't need to be announced. It was the kind of decision the body made before the mind had finished forming the thought, the survival reflex of someone who had learned that tears in certain rooms were information the wrong people could use. She breathed in through her nose. Let it out. The pressure in her chest stayed exactly where it was, but she had control of the surface of herself, and the surface was what the room could see. Where is he now? She said. London, still practicing. Still practicing, she repeated. Harriet would need him functional, Alaric said. A disgraced solicitor is a liability. A practicing one is an asset. She'd have kept him very carefully intact. Vivian looked at him. You've been building a case. I've been building several things, he said, without inflection. Some of them took longer than others. The room was quiet. Outside, the London street was dark and indifferent as ever, and somewhere in the house a clock was doing the particular thing clocks did at this hour, measuring out the distance between the world as it had been and the world as it was now. You should have told me before the wedding, she said. He didn't look away. Yes. That's not an explanation. No, he said. It isn't. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him make the decision she could see him making, the decision to not manage the information, to not construct the justification that would make his choice look better than it was. I didn't know about Ellery until 3 days ago. I knew about the second filing. I didn't know the source. He paused. I made a decision about timing that was mine to make, and I made it poorly. She held his gaze. Don't do that again, she said. Something in his face registered the words in a way she hadn't expected. Not defensiveness, not the slight frost that men of his position usually produced when a woman corrected them. Something that looked more like the expression of a man who had just been handed exactly the kind of honesty he'd said he required, and was reckoning with what it felt like to actually receive it. No, he said, I won't. She turned to the window one more time, the street, the dark, the indifference. We leave tomorrow. Tomorrow, she said. And when we arrive, I need everything. All of it. It will be ready, he said. She heard him move to the door. She heard the door open. She heard him stop. Vivian. She didn't turn. I know this isn't what you planned, he said. Any of it. I'm aware of what I've brought you into. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. The blue dress, her mother's bone structure in her face, the particular stillness she'd developed as armor over years of living in a house that wanted her invisible. I've been in difficult situations before, she said. I'm still here. The door closed. She stayed at the window for a long time. The journey north took 2 days. They traveled mostly in silence, which was a silence Vivian was learning to read the way she read everything else, by attending to its texture. It wasn't the silence of two strangers with nothing to say. It had weight to it, direction. Alaric read documents. She read nothing, which was unusual for her. She couldn't hold the words still enough. Instead, she watched the landscape change from the dense, manicured south to the rougher country of the Midlands, and then further north into something that felt genuinely old, the kind of land that had existed before the people who managed it and would exist after, indifferent to all their arrangements. On the second afternoon, somewhere in the gray-green hills of the north, he looked up from his documents and said, without preamble, "Ask me something." She looked at him. "What?" "You've been doing calculations since London," he said. "I can see it. Whatever you're calculating, you'd calculate it better with information, so ask me something." She held his gaze for a moment. "Your first wife," she said. "Did you love her?" He didn't look away, which she'd expected him to. "Yes," he said. "Not well. Not in the way she deserved, but yes." "What does that mean?" "It means I was 31, and I understood power better than I understood people," he said. "I knew how to run an estate. I knew how to negotiate. I had no idea how to be in a room with someone and let them see that the room affected me." He looked at the window. "She died knowing I loved her and not quite sure that I did. That's a specific kind of failure." Vivian was quiet. "You've thought about it a lot," she said. "For 14 years, he said. "Yes." The carriage moved through the hills. The light was changing, going gray and cold in the particular way of northern afternoons. And she thought about 31-year-old Alaric Blackthorne, who knew how to run an estate but not how to be seen in a room. She knew something about learning the wrong skills first, about becoming very good at surviving in a place that was damaging you. She didn't say this, but something in the silence between them shifted slightly, the way weather shifted, not visibly, but in some quality of the air, says. Blackthorne Castle appeared at dusk. It was not what the stories had suggested, which was the first surprise. The stories suggested something Gothic, dark spires, a sky that cooperated with the general aesthetic, the kind of brooding architectural statement that announced its owner's character in the most legible possible way. What she saw instead was a castle that had started as something severe and had, over several centuries, been modified by people who actually lived in it. Additions that reflected comfort rather than statement, windows larger than the original structure had planned for, gardens that had gone somewhat wild in a way that looked less like neglect and more like a deliberate accommodation of the landscape. It was large. It was old. It had the quality of a place that had absorbed a great deal of time. She looked at it from the carriage window and understood, with the part of her that processed things at a level below language, that people had loved this place, not just owned it, loved it, worked it, worried over it. The estate had that texture, the texture of a thing that had mattered to the people responsible for it. "It's not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" he said. She looked at him. "Something more Gothic." The corner of his mouth, the ghost of the expression. "The Gothic reputation is a management strategy," he said. "People who are afraid to approach don't send their solicitors on fishing expeditions. It's more efficient than a fence." She looked back at the castle. "You cultivated the rumor." "I let it grow," he said. "There's a difference." She filed that away with the other things she was filing. The accumulating portrait of a man who used information the way she'd learned to use it, as the only tool available to the structurally powerless. Except he wasn't powerless. He was one of the most powerful men in England, and he still thought in those terms, which meant the powerlessness had come first, and the power had arrived later, and he'd never lost the habit of the earlier version of himself. She found this, against all reasonable expectation, one of the most clarifying things she'd learned about him. But the housekeeper was a woman of 60 called Mrs. Crane, who had the bearing of someone who had run this castle for long enough that the castle had organized itself around her authority rather than the other way around. She welcomed Vivian with the specific formality of a woman who had her own assessment process and was conducting it invisibly while performing cordiality. Vivian recognized the type. She performed cordiality back, which was not the same as being warm, and watched Mrs. Crane recalibrate slightly. The rooms she was shown were not the rooms of a trophy. They were the rooms of someone who was expected to actually inhabit them. A study of her own, a dressing room that had been recently and completely restocked. A sitting room that had been organized with books already on the shelves, and she noted with a tightness in her throat she refused to examine that the books were ones she would have chosen. She stood in the sitting room after Mrs. Crane left and ran her hand along the spines. Montaigne. 3 volumes of George Eliot. A complete set of Austen, which she owned already and had not brought. 2 volumes of natural history she'd mentioned in passing to no one she could identify. She stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up Middlemarch, which she'd read 4 times, and which was the book her mother had given her on her 17th birthday, with an inscription she knew by heart, and opened it to the first page, and stood there with it in her hands, and breathed. He brought the documents himself that evening, not through a solicitor, not through a secretary. He arrived at her study with a leather case that had the weight of organized evidence and set it on her desk, with the care of someone depositing something that mattered. "Everything," he said. "The trust documents, the original filing, the fraudulent letter, and the authentication report, the second filing from last week, and the correspondence between Harriet's solicitor and Ellery going back 14 months. She looked at the case, then at him. "You've had their correspondence for 14 months, she said. "I became aware of the situation 14 months ago," he said. "I had to allow it to develop to a point where the documentation was complete enough to be irrefutable." She understood this. She also understood that for 14 months, while she'd been surviving Ashford Manor, while she'd been reading Montaigne in the early hours and doing cold arithmetic, and holding herself together with the specific discipline of someone who has no other tools, this man had been building something on her behalf in silence. She didn't have a word for what that felt like. She didn't trust the word she had. Sit down, she said. He sat. She opened the case. For the next 3 hours, they went through everything. She read documents with the focused attention she brought to anything she considered a primary source, asking questions when she needed them, not asking when she didn't. And he answered with the precision of someone who had been through these documents enough times to know them past the level of their surface content. What emerged, piece by piece, was worse than she'd assembled from the individual facts alone. The scheme had begun earlier than she'd known, not after her mother's death, but before it, in the last months of her mother's illness, when her mother had still been alive and Harriet had been in the house and Thomas Ellery had been in the house, and her mother had been dying by degrees in the bedroom at the end of the east wing, while 2 floors below, the architecture of her daughter's dispossession was being quietly constructed. Vivian sat with that fact for a moment. She put it in the place. She put things that were true and unbearable and required acknowledgement before being stored somewhere that didn't prevent function. She knew, Vivian said. Her own voice sounded odd to her, stripped of something, some layer that was usually present. My mother. In the end, she must have known something was wrong with the trust because she'd have reviewed it. She was careful. She was always... She stopped. She died knowing. Alaric was watching her. We don't know what she knew, he said, with the care of someone who understood the difference between what the evidence proved and what it implied. No, Vivian said. We don't. She closed the folder she'd been reading, put her hands flat on the desk, breathed. What's the fastest path to exposing Ellery? She said. He looked at her steadily. The authentication report on the forged letter, combined with the correspondence, is enough for a criminal complaint. The complication is that a criminal complaint against Ellery exposes the fraudulent filing and names Harriet as the primary orchestrator. Good, she said. It becomes a public scandal, he said, but the timing, given that we married 2 days ago, I know what it looks like, she said. A new bride using her husband's resources to destroy her stepmother publicly 2 days after the wedding. She paused. I don't care what it looks like. Something in his face, the deepest layer, the one that the controlled surface barely showed. Vivian, he said, if we move on this now, Harriet will know immediately that the information came from inside her own operations. Ellery will be warned. He'll destroy what he can. She looked at him. Copies. Of everything, he said. But then let him destroy the originals, she said. Let Harriet know we're coming. I want her to know. I want her to spend the next weeks understanding that the floor is giving way. She watched him absorb this. That's not efficiency, he said. No, she said, it isn't. I was quiet for a moment. And then, for the first time in any of their interactions, she saw him smile. Not the ghost, not the corner of the mouth almost expression, but the actual thing, brief and unguarded and slightly dangerous. All right, he said. She looked at the document case, at everything it contained, at 2 years of her life being organized against her by people who had assumed she was too occupied with surviving to see what they were building. I want to write a letter, she said, to Ellery. Alaric stilled. What kind of letter? The kind that tells him exactly what we have, she said. The kind that makes it clear that Harriet can't protect him. The kind that gives him 24 hours to decide whether he'd rather be the man who helps us or the man who goes down with her. The silence between them had a quality she hadn't felt before. Not tension exactly, but the specific atmosphere of 2 people in a room who have arrived at the same understanding from different directions and are standing on it together for the first time. You want to turn him, Alaric said. I want him to turn himself, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, and she held it without performing anything, and the clock somewhere in the castle measured the moment the way clocks measured everything, without judgment, without mercy, without the slightest interest in what it meant. Write the letter, he said. She pulled a sheet of paper toward her. She began to write. And in London, in an office on a street that didn't know her name, Thomas Ellery was sitting at his desk, sorting through the ordinary mechanics of his ordinary practice, entirely unaware that the girl he'd helped dispossess had married the one man in England with both the resources and the particular personality to build an irrefutable case, and that she had just decided to use it, not in 6 weeks. Not when the courts were ready. Not when the timing was optimal, and the social fallout was manageable. Now. Tonight. with a pen and a sheet of paper and the very specific anger of a woman who had done the arithmetic one final time and understood, with absolute clarity, that the only way the numbers ever changed was if you changed them yourself. She signed her name at the bottom of the letter. Not Vivian Ashford, Vivian Blackthorne. The ink was still wet when she folded it, and the name looked back at her from the page like something that had been true before she'd written it. Like the floor for the first time, holding. The letter reached London on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Thomas Ellery had read it twice, burned it, and sent a reply through a courier he paid in cash at a postal house 3 streets from his office. The kind of transaction that left no paper trail except in the memory of a courier who would forget it by nightfall for the right number of coins. The reply arrived at Blackthorne Castle on Saturday. Vivian read it standing at the desk in her study, still in the clothes she'd slept badly in, her hair not yet dressed, a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. She read it once. Then she set it down flat on the desk and looked at it the way you looked at a thing you needed to understand completely before you allowed yourself to react to it. Ellery was not turning. The letter was 3 paragraphs of careful legal language that said, between every line it actually printed, that he had been in Harriet's operation long enough to know exactly what he was worth to her and exactly what she would do to protect that worth. He named nothing explicitly. He admitted nothing. But the subtext was the architecture of a man who had calculated his options and concluded that Harriet's protection was more durable than Vivian's threat. I was wrong. But he didn't know that yet. She was still standing there when Alaric knocked and entered, which she'd told him he could do in this room. A small revision to the architecture of their arrangement that she'd made without fully examining why. He read her face before he read the letter, which she'd learned was his habit, and something in his expression adjusted to match what he found there. He picked up the letter. Read it. He thinks you're bluffing, he said. He thinks I'm a 22-year-old woman 2 days into a marriage, using her husband's stationery, she said. He thinks the threat is borrowed. Alaric set the letter down. Is it? She looked at him. No. He held her gaze for a moment with the full weight of that attention, and then he nodded once. Not agreement exactly, more acknowledgement, the recognition of a position stated clearly. Then we move to the secondary approach, he said, which is, we don't need Ellery to turn, he said. We need him to panic. There's a difference. He moved to the window, which was his habit when he was organizing something internally. The window gave him the landscape, and the landscape gave him something his mind could run against. A man who's decided he's protected stops being careful. A man who's panicking makes mistakes. We need to give him a reason to panic that he can't trace back to us. She thought about this. You want to approach someone else in Harriet's network. There's a clerk in her solicitor's firm, Alaric said. Young, not deeply embedded. He's been copying documents for Harriet for 8 months, which means he knows enough to be useful and not enough to feel safe. He turned from the window. He's been copying documents because he has debts, the kind that don't go to banks. Vivian understood. And if his debts were resolved from another direction, his loyalty to Harriet would become significantly more flexible, Alaric said. She stood with this for a moment. The cold mechanics of it, the way power actually moved in the spaces between the official structures, through the networks of obligation and fear and financial necessity that were never written in any document but were more real than any document. She'd understood this abstractly for years. She was learning it concretely, which was a different kind of knowledge, harder, more permanent. How long? She said. A week, he said. Perhaps less. She looked at the letter on her desk, at Ellery's careful paragraphs and their careful subtext. Do it, she said. The week that followed had the particular quality of a held breath. She occupied herself with the castle, which needed occupying. Mrs. Crane, who had revised her initial assessment to something more cautiously approving, showed her the accounts and the household management with the controlled wariness of a woman who had run this place for 11 years and was taking the measure of the new authority in it. Vivian went through the accounts with the same focused attention she'd brought to the legal documents, asking questions that Mrs. Crane hadn't expected her to ask, and watched the housekeeper's wariness shift incrementally toward something that had more respect in it. She walked the grounds every morning, early, before the household fully woke. The estate was larger than she'd understood from the carriage, not just the castle, but the farms, the village at the northern edge of the land, the tenants who worked it. She walked into the village on the 3rd morning without announcement and sat in the small shop there for an hour, drinking bad tea and talking to the woman who ran it, and learned more about the estate and its recent history in that hour than she'd learned from any document. What she learned was that Blackthorn was not a cursed estate. It was a managed one, tightly, carefully, by a man who'd been running it alone for 14 years, and had the specific quality of someone who'd learned to be everything the thing needed because there was no one else. She walked back to the castle in the gray morning light and thought about what it meant to keep something going alone for that long, and what it cost, and what it looked like from the outside versus the inside. Alaric found her in the library that evening. It was the first time he'd come to a room she was in without a specific transactional purpose, without documents, without news, without the forward momentum of the case. He came in with a glass of whiskey she hadn't asked for, and set it on the table beside her chair without comment, and sat down across from her in the chair that she'd noticed over the previous days he gravitated toward in this room, the one with its back to the wall and a clear line to the door, which was either habit or something older than habit. She picked up the whiskey. "You went to the village," he said. "Yes." "Mrs. Crane told you not to go alone," he said. "Mrs. Crane suggested I take a footman," she said. "I chose not to." He looked at her with the expression she'd begun to think of as his assessment face, the one that collected information without displaying the conclusions it was reaching. "Why?" "Because a woman with a footman is a duchess making an inspection," she said. "A woman alone in a shop drinking bad tea is a neighbor." She looked at the fire. "They told me things they wouldn't have told the duchess." He was quiet for a moment. "What did they tell you?" he said. "That the Northfield drainage has been inadequate for 3 years, and the tenant there has asked about it twice without resolution," she said. "That the schoolroom in the village has no adequate heating and the children leave early in winter because of it. That the previous housekeeper before Mrs. Crane was letting the household food budget be skimmed by someone in the kitchen staff. And Mrs. Crane resolved it 2 years ago, but the village still talks about it because nobody official ever acknowledged what she'd done." I was watching her. "The drainage can be fixed before winter," she said. "The schoolroom needs a new heating system, which will cost money but not a significant amount. And Mrs. Crane should be told that the estate acknowledges what she did." Alaric was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. "I'm not asking," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do." Something moved in his face that she was getting better at reading. The layer beneath the controlled surface, the one that showed itself rarely and briefly, and only when something had caught him genuinely off guard. "I understand the difference," he said. She looked at the fire. "I grew up in a house that was falling apart from the inside while maintaining a perfect surface," she said. "I know what that looks like from the people who live at its edges. I won't have that here." He said nothing for a while. The fire went through its ordinary mechanics. The whiskey was good. She noted this absently, the way you noted things that were better than expected. "Vivienne," he said finally. She looked at him. "I need to tell you something," he said, in the tone that she'd learned to recognize as his primary source voice, the one that meant what was coming was unmanaged, unfiltered, the thing itself rather than a version of it. "Before the week is out, before whatever Harriet decides to do in response to the letter." She set the glass down. "Tell me," she said. He told her about the investment scheme, not the outline she already knew. Her father's exposure, the fraudulent enterprise, the timeline before collapse. The specific details, the ones he'd been carrying in the part of his understanding that hadn't yet been transferred to her. The name of the man running it, the scale of the original deception, and the piece she hadn't known, the piece that hit her with the specific physical quality of the floor giving way again, in a direction she'd secured against, in the place she'd thought she'd stabilized. The man running the scheme was not a stranger to Alaric. It was a former associate, a man named Carver, who had been involved in 3 of Alaric's northern land transactions 8 years ago, who had been dismissed from those dealings over an irregularity that Alaric had chosen to resolve privately rather than publicly, which was a decision he had made for reasons of efficiency, and was now looking at with the expression of a man confronting the full-term consequence of a choice made in a different version of his life. "You let him go," Vivienne said. "I removed him from my dealings and recovered what he'd taken," Alaric said. "I didn't pursue it beyond that. And he went on to build a scheme that has taken my father's money and is going to destroy my family's remaining finances when it collapses." She heard her own voice. Flat. Very controlled. The surface holding something underneath that had significant pressure. "Because you made a private decision 8 years ago." He held her gaze. "Didn't qualify it. didn't construct the architecture of mitigation. Yes, he said. The room was very still. She understood in that moment the particular texture of a thing that was nobody's fault in the simple sense and everybody's fault in the complex one. The long chain of decisions, each reasonable in isolation, each contributing to an outcome nobody had planned for. She understood it not abstractly, but in the body, in the specific place where you held the things that were true and cost something. She wanted to be angry at him. She could feel the architecture of the anger available to her. The justified version, the one that had evidence behind it, the one that would be completely understandable and completely unproductive. She breathed. Can Carver be stopped before the collapse? She said. I've had someone looking at the Enterprise's structure for 3 weeks, he said. The fraudulent elements can be documented and reported to the appropriate financial authorities. The collapse, when it comes, will be controlled rather than catastrophic. Your father's losses can be partially recovered. She looked at him. Partially. Not fully, he said. No. She picked up the whiskey, put it back down without drinking. You've been managing this in parallel, she said. The trust, the Ellery situation, and Carver. Yes. Alone. He looked at her steadily. Until now. The fire cracked. The clock measured the moment without judgment. She thought about what it meant to carry the weight of multiple failing structures simultaneously, to be the only architecture between the thing and its collapse. To do it alone for years because there was no one to do it with. She thought about his wife, and 31-year-old Alaric, who didn't know how to let the room see that it affected him. She thought about 14 years of this castle and its tenants, and its drainage problems, and its embezzled food budgets, maintained by a single person because the alternative was letting it fail. She thought about her mother in the East Wing, dying, while 2 floors below the paperwork of her dispossession was being organized. She thought about the cold arithmetic of women's lives and how the numbers changed when the variables changed. I need a copy of everything you have on Carver, she said. Tonight. He stood immediately, not with surprise, with the quality of a man who had been ready to move and had been waiting for the signal. I'll have it sent to your study. I was at the door when the knock came. Not at the library door. Somewhere in the house, the main entrance, 3 floors down, at an hour when the entrance was not meant to receive visitors. The sound traveled through the castle's stone the way sound did in old buildings, arriving slightly displaced from its source, slightly ominous. They both went still. Alaric moved first. She followed him without being asked, which she suspected neither of them would have predicted, but which felt, in the moment, like the only thing that made sense. They descended to the main hall, where the night butler had already opened the door to reveal a man on the threshold, damp from the night air, travel-worn, with the specific quality of someone who had come a very long distance very quickly and was not finished moving. It was one of Alaric's London men. She'd seen him once, briefly, at Thornfield House. A quiet man whose specific function she hadn't asked about because she'd been assembling other information that day. He looked at Alaric, then at Vivian, then back at Alaric. Say it, Alaric said. Ellery is dead, the man said. This morning, his office was found locked from the inside. The authorities are calling it a heart failure. The hallway was very cold. He wasn't in poor health, Alaric said. No, the man said. He wasn't. Vivian heard this, processed it, placed it next to everything else she knew and felt the picture it made solidify into something with edges she hadn't seen before. Ellery had received her letter. Ellery had refused to turn, and within 4 days of that refusal, Ellery was dead in a locked office, which meant one of 2 things. Either Harriet had removed the risk, which was the action of a woman who had decided that silence was cheaper than loyalty, or someone else had removed the risk, which was the action of a person who had interests in the situation that neither Vivian nor Alaric had fully mapped. She looked at Alaric. His face had the quality she'd seen on it only once before, in the carriage on the first day, when he'd told her about Ellery and she'd watched the deepest layer of his expression do the thing it rarely did. He was not performing composure. He was the specific stillness of a man who has just understood that the terrain has changed in a fundamental way and is running the new map against everything he thought he knew. The correspondence, she said, Ellery's copies, were in his office, Alaric's man said, which was thoroughly searched before the authorities arrived. Gone. 14 months of correspondence between Harriet's solicitor and Ellery, the evidence that named Harriet directly, that connected the forged documents to a specific human decision chain, gone from a locked office on a London street, and Thomas Ellery dead beside it. Vivian stood in the cold hallway of Blackthorn Castle and understood that the case she had spent a week building had just lost its foundation. And then the second knock came. Different door. The side entrance, off the kitchen. The entrance that staff used, the one that wasn't meant for correspondents or visitors. The night butler looked at Alaric. Alaric nodded. The door opened to a girl of perhaps 16, travel-damp and frightened with the specific quality of someone who has been frightened for long enough that the expression had become structural. She had a letter in her hand that she extended without speaking, because speaking appeared to be beyond her current capacity. Vivian took the letter. She recognized the handwriting before she read the salutation. She'd grown up in the same house as this handwriting, had watched it across years of household notes and social correspondence, and the occasional letter slipped under a door at night when its author was, in her rare weak moments, capable of something approaching honesty. Cecily. She read the letter. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Alaric and knew her face was showing something it hadn't shown in front of him before. Not the controlled surface, not the survival stillness, but the actual thing underneath. The thing with no management on it at all. Harriet isn't moving against the trust anymore, she said. Alaric was watching her with that complete attention, the one that collected everything. She's moving against you, Vivian said, directly. She's filed a petition with the court claiming the marriage was obtained under false pretenses. She stopped. She has a witness. Who? Alaric said. The word that came out of her mouth next was the one she'd least expected to say, the name that reorganized every assumption she'd built over the previous week, that reached back into the architecture of her understanding and pulled something foundational out of it. She said the name, and Alaric went completely still. Not the controlled stillness, not the practiced composure. The other kind, the kind that meant the information had arrived somewhere deeper than the management layer, had hit something that the discipline couldn't fully cover, had found the specific place where even a man who had spent 30 years learning to be unreadable couldn't prevent the room from seeing that it had struck. Because the name, she said, was not a stranger's name. It was not Harriet's man. It was not Ellery's replacement. It was not anyone from the network of London solicitors and financial operators and quiet couriers who moved through the case like water through stone. It was someone inside Blackthorn itself, someone who had been here long enough to know the estate's business, long enough to have been trusted with the specific details of Alaric's legal preparations, long enough to have watched Vivian arrive and write her letter and sign her new name and believe, for the space of a week, that the floor was finally holding. The girl on the threshold was still standing there, cold and frightened, having carried the message that cracked everything open. And Vivian stood in the hallway of her new home, the word home doing something strange and painful in her chest, the word she hadn't used for any place in 2 years, with a letter in her hand and the name of a traitor in the air between herself and the man she'd married, and understood with the specific, total clarity of someone who has just reached a point from which there is no returning, that everything she had been was not enough for what came next. Surviving had been a skill. Enduring had been a skill. Doing the cold arithmetic and choosing the most functional path through an impossible situation, these were the skills of a woman who had learned to live inside other people's decisions about her life. What came next required something else entirely. She looked at Alaric, and she looked at the letter, and she looked at the girl on the threshold who had run from London with Cecily's words in her hand, and she made the decision that she felt not as a choice, but as the end of every other option. She was done surviving other people's designs. She folded Cecily's letter, put it in her pocket, looked at Alaric with eyes that were not performing anything. Tell me, she said, everything about the person who betrayed us, everything you know and everything you suspect, tonight, all of it. He looked at her for one long moment, and for the first time since she'd known him, since the rain-gray morning they'd stood in a formal room with solicitors and signed a contract for a life she hadn't chosen, she saw something in his face that wasn't the controlled surface or the ghost expression or the careful precision of a man who had learned to manage everything he showed. She saw something that looked like the specific recognition of a man watching someone become, in real time, the person they'd always been capable of being. All right, he said. And the night moved forward, and the castle held its cold breath around them, and somewhere in London Harriet Ashford read the first confirmation that her witness had delivered, and smiled. The traitor's name was Holt, not a stranger, not a hired infiltrator placed from the outside like a piece on a board. Robert Holt had been Alaric's estate secretary for 9 years, the man who managed correspondence, who knew the filing architecture of every legal document in the castle, who had sat in this very study 3 weeks ago while Alaric assembled the case against Harriet, and had written notes in his precise, economical hand that had then traveled south to London in a coat pocket on a morning he'd claimed to spend in the village. Alaric told her this standing in the hallway at midnight with the cold coming through the stone, and his voice carrying the specific flatness of a man processing a betrayal that had reached somewhere the composure didn't fully cover. 9 years. The number sat in the air between them like something physical. Vivienne watched his face while he talked. Not the surface. She was past reading the surface. The layer beneath it, the one that showed itself in the quality of his stillness, in the way his jaw held, in the particular absence of the ghost expression that had become his most readable tell. He was not performing steadiness. He was actually steady, which was different, and the difference cost him something she could see being paid in real time. A man who had spent 9 years building careful walls around everything that mattered had just learned that one of the hands that helped build them had been measuring the gaps. "How much does he know?" she said. "Everything I prepared in the 2 weeks before the wedding," Alaric said. "The documentation on the trust, the authentication report, the correspondence between Harriet's solicitor and Ellery." He paused. "The approach to the clerk in the firm." She understood immediately. "Harriet knew we were coming for the clerk." "Before we ever moved," he said. The clerk would have been warned. The documents Alaric had been counting on as a secondary lever, gone, repositioned, or destroyed before they were ever touched. The case they'd spent a week constructing had not just lost its foundation with Ellery's death. It had been actively dismantled from the inside while they were building it. She thought about 9 years, about the specific violence of a betrayal that long in the making, not the sharp violence of an attack, but the slow, retrospective kind, the kind that reached back through time and rewrote the texture of things you'd believed were solid. She knew that kind. She'd been living in it for 2 years. "Where's Holt now?" she said. "He left the estate yesterday morning," Alaric said. "I didn't know why at the time. I assumed estate business in the village." Something moved in his face. "I should have known." "You couldn't have known," she said. "I should have anyway," he said, and the weight in it was not self-pity. It was the specific accounting of a man who held himself to a standard that didn't make exceptions for what was reasonable. She looked at him for a moment. "The petition Harriet filed," she said. "False pretenses. What is the actual claim?" "That I concealed the full nature of the bloodline condition from your father prior to the marriage agreement," he said. "That had he known the complete medical history, he would not have consented to the match." "And Holt's testimony confirms that I was aware of the full diagnosis and chose to disclose only a partial version during negotiations," Alaric said. "He was present for 2 conversations with my physician last year. Out of context, those conversations can be made to support Harriet's framing." Vivienne did the arithmetic. The petition, if successful, would void the marriage. A voided marriage meant she returned to Ashford Manor as Vivienne Ashford, without the Blackthorn name, without the resources, without the legal standing that the marriage had given her to challenge the trust. It was elegant. Not the Harriet she'd underestimated, but the Harriet she should have been accounting for from the beginning. The woman who had managed her father's grief into a legal stranglehold and spent 2 years systematically dismantling her mother's estate didn't make inefficient moves. She'd let the direct approach fail. She'd watched them build the case and fed them enough rope to invest in it. And then she'd cut the foundation out and filed the petition simultaneously, which meant that while Vivienne and Alaric had been sitting in the library drinking whiskey and talking about drainage problems, the counter-move had already been executed. "When is the hearing?" Vivienne said. 14 days, Alaric said. 14 days. She looked at the girl from London, Cecily's messenger, still standing on the threshold with her damp coat and her frightened eyes. Vivienne looked at her with direct attention. "What's your name?" she said. The girl blinked. "Mary, ma'am. Miss Cecily's maid." "How did you get here, Mary?" "Miss Cecily gave me money for the coach," she said. "She said I was to put the letter in your hands only. She said—" She stopped, swallowed. "She said to tell you she's sorry. She said you'd know what that meant." Vivienne knew what it meant. It meant Cecily had known about the petition before it was filed. It meant Cecily had chosen, in whatever limited way was available to a 17-year-old girl living inside Harriet's house, to warn rather than stay silent. It meant the arithmetic of women's lives was more complicated than the model Vivian had been running, and she filed that revision somewhere she'd come back to. Get her a room and something hot, she told Mrs. Crane, who had appeared at the edge of the hallway with the quality of a woman who had managed crises in this house before, and had arrived at the preparatory position without needing to be summoned. She stays here. Mrs. Crane took Mary away. The hallway contracted to Vivian, Alaric, and the problem. 14 days, Vivian said again, to rebuild a case that's been systematically stripped. The copies, Alaric said. I have copies of everything Holt saw, but copies without originals to corroborate them. A skilled opposing barrister will argue fabrication. Then we need a new primary source, she said. Something Holt didn't know about. Something Harriet hasn't been able to reach. She was already moving toward the study. He followed. They worked through the night, not romantically. Not the way she might have described it later, sitting at a distance from the facts. It was brutal, close work, the kind that required the specific combination of sustained attention and physical endurance that she hadn't known she possessed until she found herself at 4 a.m. still reading through estate correspondence from 8 years ago, looking for Carver, looking for the thread that connected Harriet's operation to something that predated Holt's access, something original and undisturbed. Alaric worked across the desk from her. He'd removed his jacket at some point. She'd noticed this peripherally without looking up, had registered it the way you registered changes in light. He had the working quality of someone who'd spent years doing exactly this, alone, at exactly this kind of hour, and the fact of another person in the room with him had a visible effect. She wasn't analyzing directly, but was aware of in the way you were aware of weather. At 4:30 she found it. Not a document from Holt's period. Older. A letter from 7 years ago, filed in a correspondence archive that Holt had access to but hadn't flagged, probably because it predated his employment and he hadn't known to look for it. A letter from Carver to a business associate that named, in the direct language of a man who believed the letter was private, 2 other investors in his current scheme. One of the names was a London banker Vivian didn't recognize. The other name was Lady Harriet Ashford. The silence that arrived in the room when Vivian read the name aloud had a physical quality, the specific silence of something snapping into place after years of pressure. Alaric looked at the letter. She's an investor, he said. She's not just orchestrating the fraud for the money from my inheritance, Vivian said. She's been inside it from the beginning. She knows the timeline. She knows when it collapses. She looked at him. The £60,000 my father is going to lose when it collapses. She knows exactly where it's going. She structured it. She watched him absorb this. She needed the marriage to happen, he said slowly, not just for the inheritance, to get your father legally entangled with the Blackthorn name in time for the collapse. When it falls, the scandal attaches to you, to us. The complete picture arrived fully assembled, and it was worse than either version they'd had before. Not a stepmother running a financial scheme. A woman who had spent 3 years building a structure in which Vivian was a central load-bearing element, something to leverage, to dispossess, and then to use as a social anchor for a catastrophe she'd engineered from the inside. Vivian sat with it. She breathed through the cold of it, the scale of it, the specific nausea of understanding that she had been a variable in someone else's calculation for years before she'd known the equation existed. Then she put it in the place she put unbearable true things and looked at what the new information changed. This letter, she said, 7 years old, predates Holt, predates everything Harriet knew we were building. Yes, Alaric said. She doesn't know we have it. He looked at her steadily. No. Then we have 14 days and 1 card she hasn't seen, she said, and I know exactly where to play it. She slept 3 hours and woke before the household. She walked to the village in the pre-dawn gray, which had become her practice in the week she'd been here. The walk that gave her the landscape, and the landscape gave her something her mind could move against. She was aware, walking, of the specific quality of the morning, the way the cold came up from the ground, and the light came over the hills at an angle that made everything look like it had been there since the beginning of things. The estate around her, the farms and the stone walls and the village at the northern edge, existing in their ordinary permanence, while inside the castle there were documents that could bring a woman's constructed life down around her. She thought about her mother, which she hadn't let herself do fully in weeks, had been keeping it managed, stored, functional. She let herself think about it now, in the cold morning with no one watching. Her mother, who had trusted Thomas Ellery for 11 years, who had died with a compromised trust and a daughter who didn't know it was compromised, who had loved this girl enough to put £40,000 aside for her in the most legally protected structure available, and had not been able to protect it from the specific kind of rot that came from inside. There was a particular kind of grief that arrived late, not at the funeral, not in the raw period after, but years later when you finally understood the full shape of what had been taken. Vivian stood in the gray morning and let it arrive and held it and breathed and didn't perform anything for anyone because there was no one here to perform for. Then she walked back to the castle. The next 12 days were the hardest work of her life. She wrote letters she didn't tell Alaric about, to people she'd identified from the estate correspondence, former associates of Carver's, who had extracted themselves from his schemes early and had specific reason to want the whole structure documented and exposed. She wrote them herself, in her own name, not the Blackthorne name, Vivian Ashford Blackthorne, which was a name that meant something to people who had known her mother, which was more people than Harriet had accounted for. 2 of them wrote back within 4 days. One of them had documentation. She brought it to Alaric on the 9th day and watched his face do the thing it did when something arrived that he hadn't planned for. The brief recalibration, the taking stock. "You did this without telling me," he said. "I did it alongside everything else," she said. "You were working the Carver financial thread. I was working the witness thread. We were both working." He looked at the letters, at the documentation, at the shape of what she'd assembled in 9 days from a castle in the north of England, using a name she'd had for less than 2 weeks. "Your mother's reputation," he said quietly. "People respected her." "Yes," Vivian said. "They did." He looked at her with the expression that wasn't the ghost, and wasn't the controlled surface, but was the thing she'd only seen a few times, the actual thing, unmanaged. "She would have been proud of you," he said. It arrived somewhere she hadn't defended. She held it there for a moment. Didn't perform anything around it, just held it and breathed and let it be exactly what it was. 2 days, she said. "We need to be in London in 2 days." They arrived in London on the 13th day. The hearing was the following morning at 9. They went directly to the office of Alaric's barrister, a man named Ashworth, who had the quality of someone who had spent 40 years in the English legal system and had arrived at a state of professional composure that was genuinely indifferent to the weight of what was placed on his desk, which was the most useful quality a barrister could have. Ashworth went through everything they'd assembled over 3 hours. He asked precise questions. He made notes. His expression didn't change, which was either encouraging or the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned to give nothing away before a hearing. At the end of the 3 hours, he looked up. "The Carver letter is significant," he said. "Combined with the financial documentation from your associates, Lady Blackthorne, it reframes the petition entirely. We're no longer defending a marriage. We're exposing the petition itself as an instrument of a larger fraud." "Can you do it in one hearing?" Vivian said. Ashworth looked at her over his reading glasses with the expression of a man revising an initial assessment. "That depends considerably on what Lady Harriet brings to the room." "She'll bring Holt," Alaric said. "Then we discredit Holt," Vivian said. "His employment records, the timeline of when he began correspondence with Harriet's solicitor relative to when he had access to the documentation he claimed to witness." "We can establish the timeline," Ashworth said. "But Holt is a credible witness on paper. 9 years of employment. No previous irregularity on record." He paused. "The hearing will be difficult." "I know," Vivian said. Ashworth looked at her again. "You'll be present." "Yes," she said. "Lady Blackthorne," he said with the care of a man who was selecting words for their precision, "the opposing barrister will attempt to establish that you are a young woman who married under circumstances you didn't fully understand, being managed now by your husband's resources and legal apparatus. If you speak, you remove that framing entirely. But speaking also means cross-examination." "I understand what cross-examination is," she said. "Lady Harriet's barrister is a man named Greaves," Ashworth said. "He is not kind." She held Ashworth's gaze steadily. "Neither am I, when it matters." The barrister looked at her for a moment, then at Alaric, then back at the documents on his desk. "Very well," he said. "We begin at 9. The night before the hearing, Vivian couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark in the London house. Her mother's city, the city where she'd spent childhood winters in the townhouse on Welbeck Street that Harriet had sold 18 months after the funeral. and listened to the house breathe, and did the arithmetic one final time. She heard Alaric's door open, heard him in the hallway, heard him stop outside her door with the quality of a person who had arrived at a decision point and was standing on it. She opened the door before he knocked. He was dressed still, hadn't slept either, which she could see in the particular quality of his face at this hour. Not exhausted exactly, but stripped of several of its management layers by the accumulated weight of the days. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before tomorrow." "Then tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment that had the specific texture of a man organizing something that didn't organize easily, something that had been kept in a form it wasn't meant to stay in for too long. "If Greaves establishes enough doubt tomorrow," he said, "the court may suspend the case pending further investigation. That suspension could last months. During that period, the Carver scheme will collapse. The financial scandal will attach to your father's name. Harriet's lawyers will use it to argue that your family's finances created a coercive marriage environment." He paused. "You could lose the Blackthorn name, and everything with it." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "If that happens," he said, "I want you to know that the copies, every document, the Carver letter, the financial records, everything, are in a deposit at 3 separate institutions under your name. Not mine, yours. Whatever happens in that room tomorrow, you have what you need to continue." She held the weight of this. Not the legal mechanics of it, she'd already understood those. The other thing, the thing underneath the information. He had spent the 2 weeks since their wedding building her an escape route from the worst version of the outcome. Quietly, without announcing it. The way he did everything that actually mattered. She thought about the girl in the East Corridor in 1882, sitting down on the floor with a crying child. About a man 61 years old who'd been watching for someone who sat down on floors when no one was watching, and had spent years deciding whether he had the right to do anything useful with that observation. She thought about what it meant to be chosen. Not managed, not leveraged, not organized into someone else's structure. Chosen. "Alaric," she said. He looked at her with the thing she could read now. The actual thing, the one that lived beneath the controlled surface, and the ghost expression, and the 40 years of learning to organize everything he showed. She stepped back from the door. He understood what the movement meant. "I'm not doing this because of tomorrow," she said. "I need you to know that." "I know," he said. "So do I." They arrived at the court at 8:45. Harriet was already there. She stood in the corridor outside the hearing room in a dress of deep charcoal gray, her formal armor, her most composed configuration, with Holt beside her and her barrister, Greaves, on her left. She looked at Vivian across the corridor with the expression that had been her primary register for 2 years, contempt overlaid with the careful pleasure of a woman who believed she held the superior position. For 2 years, that look had made Vivian feel the specific smallness of a person being assessed and dismissed by someone with more structural power. For 2 years, she'd absorbed it and managed it and stored it in the place where she kept the unbearable true things. She looked back at Harriet now and felt something different. Not the smallness, not the managed survival response. Something cleaner and considerably more dangerous. Harriet's expression shifted, barely, but visibly. The contempt was still there, but underneath it, something had registered that it hadn't expected to find. Alaric was beside her. He looked at Harriet with the expression he used for people who had made decisions he'd calculated the full consequence of, and they hadn't. Greaves looked at them both with the professional assessment of a man who was revising his opening strategy. The clerk opened the hearing room door. "Your moment," Alaric said quietly, beside her. "Our moment," she said. He looked at her. The ghost expression arrived fully for the first time. Not a ghost, the actual thing, brief and unguarded and more honest than anything she'd seen on his face in the weeks they'd known each other. They walked in. Harriet followed. And across the room, at the respondent's table, Greaves opened his case documents, and Vivian saw in the precise, cold way of someone who has done arithmetic long enough to recognize when the numbers are different than expected, something on the top of his file that she hadn't anticipated. A document she didn't recognize. A signature at the bottom that she could read from across the room. Her father's. Not forged. She knew her father's signature. She'd been seeing it on estate documents since childhood. Her father had signed something. Recently, the ink had the quality of new documents, pages that hadn't aged. Something that predated the hearing by days. something that Greaves was arranging now at the top of his file with the particular care of a man who knew his opening position was stronger than his opponent had accounted for. Vivian sat down, breathed. The room filled with the specific silence of a space about to become the site of something that couldn't be undone. She looked at the document across the room and ran the arithmetic with everything she had, and the picture it made was the one she'd been afraid of since the night she'd read Cecily's letter. Not the version where Harriet overplayed her hand, but the version where someone who loved Vivian had been persuaded or coerced or simply broken down by the accumulated weight of the past 2 years into giving Harriet exactly the weapon she needed. Her father. The man who was not cruel. The man who was weak in the way that kind men with inadequate spines were weak. The man who had let everything happen by not preventing it, who had signed Vivian's bride price on a Tuesday morning between breakfast and the dressmaker's appointment, who had apparently signed something else this week that Greaves was now placing at the top of his opening argument. Greaves stood. Alaric's hand rested on the table beside hers, not touching, not performing anything for the room, simply present in the way that things were present when they'd decided to stay. Greaves opened his mouth. And Vivian looked at the document across the room and understood, with the absolute clarity of someone standing at the exact point of no return, that the next 60 seconds would determine not just the hearing, but everything. The name, the estate, the 40,000 pounds, her mother's trust, the case against Harriet, the case against Carver, all of it balanced on whatever her father had signed and whatever she was about to do about it, with no script, no prepared defense, no version of herself that had anticipated this particular floor giving way in this particular direction. Only what she actually was, standing in a room that required something she hadn't known she had until the moment she needed it most. Greaves stood and cleared his throat with the practiced authority of a man who understood that the first 10 seconds of any legal proceeding established the atmospheric conditions for everything that followed. He said, "My lord, I wish to enter into evidence a document signed 4 days ago by Sir Edmund Ashford, father of the respondent, in which he attests that his consent to the marriage of his daughter Vivian to Duke Alaric Blackthorne was obtained under conditions of material misrepresentation regarding the Duke's medical history and capacity." He placed the document on the clerk's desk. The room absorbed this. Vivian looked at the document, at her father's signature at the bottom of it, in the handwriting she'd known since childhood, the slightly left-leaning cursive of a man who'd been taught to write by a tutor who favored the continental style. She knew that handwriting. She knew the specific way he formed his capital E, the slight hesitation before the final stroke of the D in Edmund that meant he was uncertain about something and was signing anyway because he'd been told to. She knew, looking at it, that he hadn't understood what he was signing, or he had understood in the partial way of a man who'd been presented with a version of the facts curated to produce a specific signature, and had been too exhausted or too afraid or too comprehensively managed by years of Harriet's particular architecture to ask the questions that would have changed the answer. Greaves continued. He was building his opening with the efficiency of someone who'd prepared this structure carefully, the medical history first, establishing the Duke's concealment, then the financial context of the marriage arrangement, establishing coercion, then the father's testimony to anchor the emotional claim. It was technically sound. In a room where Vivian's evidence didn't exist, it would have been persuasive. Ashworth leaned toward her. "Lady Blackthorne, the document establishes—" "I know what it establishes," she said quietly. She was looking at her father, who was seated in the gallery to the left of the respondent's side. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the middle distance with the quality of a man who had arrived at the specific terminus of his own weakness and was sitting in it, unable to look at what it had cost. She felt something that wasn't anger. It was the feeling that arrived after you'd run out of anger about a particular thing, the tired, accurate recognition of a pattern you'd understood for years, but had never had the specific occasion to see this clearly. Her father was not cruel. He had never been cruel. He had simply, repeatedly, chosen the path that required the least structural courage, and the accumulated weight of those choices had built a life in which his daughter had been sold twice. Once to Harriet's household, once to the possibility of losing everything in a courtroom by the same fundamental failure. Greaves finished his opening. Ashworth rose. He presented their counter-evidence with the methodical precision she'd come to expect from him. The Carver letter, the financial documentation from her mother's network, the timeline establishing Holt's communications with Harriet's solicitor. He was building the architecture of the counter-argument with care. And she watched the judge's face while he did, and read it the way she read everything, by attending to the quality of its attention, where the focus sharpened, where it remained neutral. The judge was listening. That was something. Then Greaves cross-examined Alaric. She watched this with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting for the specific place where the terrain gets dangerous and wants to know exactly what it looks like when it arrives. Greaves was skilled. She'd known he would be. And the skill was specifically the skill of finding the places where a man's controlled surface and his actual interior were slightly misaligned and pressing there with precision. He pressed on the medical concealment, on the conversation with the physician that Holt had witnessed, on the specific language Alaric had used with her father's solicitor during the negotiations. Alaric answered everything with the flatness of absolute truth, which was the only register that worked when you were actually telling the truth in a room designed to produce doubt. His voice didn't change. His hands were still on the table. He was the specific quality of immovable that came not from rigidity, but from the structural integrity of someone who had nothing to hide in this particular room because he'd long since made peace with what he was hiding in other ones. Greaves pushed harder, asked about the first wife, about Priscilla Vane, about the pattern of women who entered the Duke's life and suffered for it. Alaric said, without inflection, "My first wife died of a fever in 1873. That is documented in her physician's records. Lady Priscilla Vane is alive and living in Portugal. I can provide her current address if the court requires verification." The room shifted slightly. Greaves had expected the rumor to land, and it hadn't, because the rumor was being answered with a specific address in Portugal, which was not the response of a man with something to conceal. Greaves sat down with the controlled composure of someone recalibrating. Ashworth said, "Lady Blackthorne, your witness." She stood. She'd been told, by Ashworth, by every social architecture she'd grown up inside, by the accumulated instruction of a world that had very specific ideas about what 22-year-old women did in formal rooms. She'd been told, in 100 different languages over a lifetime, that the correct posture was a kind of managed smallness, that you took up the appropriate amount of space, that you deferred to the structure of the room and the authority of its inhabitants, and expressed your position through the approved channels in the approved register. She stood, and she was not small, and she did not defer, and she looked at the judge with the direct attention of someone who had run out of the energy required to perform the approved version of herself. "My lord," she said, "I'd like to speak to the document Sir Edmund Ashford signed." The judge looked at her over his glasses with the assessment of a man who had been on this bench for 23 years and was recalibrating an expectation in real time. "You may proceed, Lady Blackthorne." She said, "My father signed that document because he was told it would protect me. He was told that the marriage had been coerced by misrepresentation, that challenging it was in my best interest, and that his signature was a father's protective act." She paused. "He was not told that the woman who brought him that document has been systematically stealing my mother's estate for 2 years. He was not told that she is an investor in the fraudulent enterprise that has taken the majority of his remaining capital. He was not told that the solicitor who notarized that signature was the same solicitor who filed the fraudulent documents challenging my mother's trust." The room was very still. She looked at Harriet. Harriet was in the gallery on the right, seated with the composure of a woman who had prepared for opposition and believed she'd accounted for its dimensions. She held Vivian's gaze with the practiced contempt of 2 years of practice, the look that said, "You are a variable in my calculation, and you have overestimated your weight." Vivian held her gaze and felt, very clearly, the place where fear used to live in her chest when she met that look. The place that had been hollowed out by 2 years of cold arithmetic and 1 month of understanding, piece by assembled piece, the full architecture of what Harriet had built, and why. The fear wasn't there. What was there instead was cleaner and harder and considerably more useful. She placed the Carver letter on the clerk's desk, the financial documentation from her mother's associates, the timeline Ashworth had compiled, and last, the document she'd saved for this specific moment, the one she hadn't shown Ashworth until the previous night because she'd needed to be sure of its weight before she deployed it. A letter from Carver himself, not 7 years old. Recent, written 3 weeks ago to a former associate who had then forwarded it to Vivian's London contact, the first investor who'd responded to her letters from Blackthorne Castle. In it, Carver named his primary financial backers for the scheme. In it, because he was a man who believed the letter was private, he was specific about the arrangement with Harriet. The percentage, the timeline, the plan for the controlled collapse that would transfer losses to her husband's name while protecting her investment. Greaves looked at the letter. She watched him look at it. Watched the recalibration happen in real time. The specific recalibration of a man who has prepared an argument for one terrain and has just been handed a map that shows the terrain is completely different. He stood. "My lord, I request time to review." "You'll have the standard period," the judge said, with the tone of a man who had already revised his model of this hearing twice and was not going to revise it a third time in the petitioner's favor. He looked at Harriet in the gallery with the specific attention of a bench that had just had its time wasted in a specific and documentable way. Harriet looked at the letter. For the first time in 2 years, Vivian watched Harriet's composure do something it had never done in her presence. Not shatter. Harriet was not a woman who shattered, but the specific quality of her certainty changed, and in that change, Vivian saw the architecture underneath the performance for the first time. The thing Harriet had always been managing, all the way down. Not confidence, not power. The very specific and exhausting discipline of a woman who had built everything she had from nothing and spent every moment since terrified of returning to it. Vivian recognized it. She knew the shape of that fear. She'd been living adjacent to it for 2 years without knowing what she was looking at. She sat down. Alaric's hand was on the table beside hers. She put her hand over his briefly. Not for the room, not for the gallery, not for the record. For him. Because he'd sat in this room and been cross-examined about the worst rumors attached to his name and had answered them with a specific address in Portugal, and that deserved acknowledgement. He turned his hand and held hers. The hearing lasted 4 more hours. Greaves was thorough and skilled and operated with the professional integrity of a man who had been handed a case that was not what he'd been told it was, which showed in his eyes, though not in his argument. He pushed every angle available to him. He was, in the end, pushing against a structure that Vivian had spent 2 weeks building from a castle in the north of England with her mother's name and one 7-year-old letter and the specific stubbornness of someone who had stopped surviving other people's designs. At 3:30, the judge ruled the petition dismissed. He ruled the trust documentation fraudulent. He referred the matter of Thomas Ellery's death to the appropriate investigative authorities. He referred the Carver financial documentation to the financial regulatory body. He looked at Harriet Ashford with the expression of a man who has understood, in the course of an afternoon, the full dimensions of a thing, and said that he expected her solicitor to present himself to the court within 48 hours. Harriet left the gallery without speaking to anyone. Vivian watched her go. The charcoal gray dress, the straight back, the specific quality of her exit. Not defeated, not broken, because Harriet was not a woman who broke, but diminished in a way that was more final than breaking. The thing she'd built had not survived its encounter with the person she'd underestimated at the center of it. She was gone through the door. Vivian turned away. Her father was waiting in the corridor. She'd known he would be. He had the quality of a man who has been sitting with something for a long time and has arrived, finally, at the specific point where sitting with it is no longer an option, where you have to stand up and walk through whatever door is in front of you, regardless of what it costs. He looked older than she remembered, which was not possible. She'd seen him at the wedding 2 weeks ago. What had changed was something in the quality of his face, the specific softness of a man whose self-deception had finally run out of structural support. She stopped in front of him. He said, "I didn't know what I was signing." "I know," she said. "She told me—" "I know what she told you," Vivian said. "I know exactly what she told you, and how she told you, and why it worked." She looked at him steadily. "I've been watching her do it for 2 years. He held her gaze with difficulty. He was not a man who found sustained eye contact easy when it contained this much truth. He never had been. He'd always been easier with warmth than with accountability, which was the specific configuration of a man who'd been loved readily and had never had to develop the harder kind of strength. "Vivian," he said, "I'm sorry." She looked at her father, at the man who had held her hand at her mother's funeral and wept with the totality of someone who had not prepared for loss, who had then turned that loss over to the first person who offered to manage it for him, and had spent 2 years not looking at the cost. She looked at him and felt the thing that arrived on the other side of anger when you'd done enough arithmetic to understand how someone got to where they were. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not yet. Forgiveness was a structure that took time to build, and she was standing in a courthouse corridor and she didn't have the resources for construction today. But the thing before forgiveness, the willingness to look at a person clearly, without the distortion of either idealization or contempt, and see the actual human dimensions of what they were. I know, she said. We'll talk. Not today. He nodded. He looked briefly at Alaric beside her, with the specific expression of a man assessing someone who has protected his daughter in ways he failed to, and arriving at a conclusion about that fact that cost him something. He left. She stood in the corridor and breathed and let the day settle into its actual weight. They went back to Blackthorn that evening. The journey north was different from the first one. The same countryside, the same shifting light, the same gray-green hills arriving as the south gave way to the Midlands and then to the genuine north. But the quality of the silence between them in the carriage was different. It had the texture of something that had been tested and had held, which was a different kind of silence than the tentative kind they'd traveled in 2 weeks ago. Somewhere in the Midlands, Alaric looked up from the window. I need to tell you something, he said. Again, she said, which was not quite a smile but had the shape of one, the ghost expression, fully present. Again, he agreed. He was quiet for a moment with the quality she'd learned was him organizing something that didn't organize in the standard way, the things that lived below the management layer, that required a different kind of access than the operational ones. I have spent 30 years, he said, being very good at the wrong things. She looked at him. Running the estate, he said, managing assets, building legal cases, keeping people at the distance that made them useful without making them dangerous. He paused. When Margaret died, I told myself it was grief that made me careful. When Priscilla left, I told myself it was wisdom. By the time I was 50, I had constructed an entire philosophy around the idea that the correct relationship between myself and other people was one of managed distance. He looked at his hands. I was very convincing, mostly to myself. The carriage moved through the landscape. The light was going amber and low over the hills. And then, he said, I saw a girl sit down on a floor with a crying child, and I couldn't construct a managed distance philosophy around it, and I spent 6 years trying before I stopped trying. She held this. What made you stop? She said. I turned 60, he said, and I was in the North Field. The same drainage problem you found. As it happens, I've been avoiding it for 3 years. And I was standing in a field with bad drainage at 60 years old, and I thought, the thing you are most afraid of is not being alone. The thing you are most afraid of is letting someone in and having them leave and having to survive that again. He met her eyes. And then I thought, you have already arranged your entire life around surviving something that hasn't happened. You have been paying the cost of the loss without getting anything for it. He looked at the window. So I wrote to your father, he said, through intermediaries. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about what it meant. Not the romantic version, not the version that softened the edges, but the actual thing. A man of 60 standing in a field with bad drainage and arriving, through the specific loneliness of someone who has been disciplined and careful and managed for 30 years, at the decision that the cost he was paying was no longer worth the protection it purchased. She thought about herself. About the girl who had done cold arithmetic in a library at dawn and called it philosophy, and called it survival, and had been right that it was survival, and had not yet understood what it was surviving her toward. You're terrible at drainage problems, she said. The actual smile arrived, not the ghost, the full thing, brief and unguarded and slightly crooked in a way that made him look, for a moment, like a much younger version of himself. I am, he agreed. It's being addressed. They arrived at Blackthorn as the last light left the hills. The castle rose out of the dark with its irregular additions and its larger-than-original windows and the quality she'd identified on the first night, the texture of a place that had mattered to the people responsible for it. She looked at it from the carriage window and felt the thing that had been building for a month, quiet and persistent, under all the arithmetic and the evidence and the cold mechanics of survival. It felt like hers. Not in the legal sense, though it was that too, as of this afternoon. In the way that a place felt like yours when you'd decided you were going to take care of it. When you'd walked its grounds in the pre-dawn gray and learned its drainage problems, and sat in its village shop drinking bad tea, and understood the human texture of the thing you were responsible for. She'd spent 2 years in a house that had belonged to her family for generations, and had never felt like anything but a space she was temporarily occupying between other people's decisions. She'd been here a month, and it already felt different in the specific way of something you've invested yourself in, something that has received a piece of your actual attention and given something back. Mrs. Crane met them at the door. The Northfield drainage survey came back, she said, with the efficiency of a woman for whom the estate's operational needs took precedence over the day's legal drama. Mr. Farrow says it can be fixed before the first freeze if we start the week after next. Start next week, Vivian said. Mrs. Crane's expression did the thing it did when Vivian said something that revised her estimate. She nodded and went. Vivian stood in the entrance hall of Blackthorn Castle and felt the specific quality of a day that had asked everything she had and had received it and had produced this specific entrance hall, this castle, this name, this man beside her, who had spent 30 years building walls and 6 years deciding whether to open one door. She'd thought a month ago that she was being sold. She'd been right, technically. The transaction had been real. The ledger of what she'd cost and what they'd paid had been written in actual numbers and actual documents, but there was another kind of accounting, the kind that didn't appear in any document, that no solicitor could file or opposing barrister could challenge. The kind that arrived not in an office or a courtroom, but standing in a field with bad drainage at 60 years old, deciding that the cost of the protection was higher than the cost of the loss. The kind that arrived sitting in a library in the early hours, doing cold arithmetic, and calling it philosophy, and finding, on the other side of every calculation, a situation you hadn't been told to find, but had found anyway. She thought about her mother, about the £40,000 that was now legally and formally and irrevocably hers, sitting in a trust that Harriet Ashford could not touch from wherever the next months were going to put her, about a woman who had loved her daughter enough to protect a number in a document and had not been able to protect everything, and had done what she could with what she had. It was what people did. It was the only thing they could do. You built what you could with the materials available and the time you had, and you hoped it was enough to matter after you were gone, and sometimes it was. Her mother's trust had survived, imperfectly, with damage and cost and 2 years of cold arithmetic to defend it. But it had survived, and the woman who had tried to take it had not. That was something. It was not everything. It was something. In the weeks that followed, Blackthorn did what Vivian had observed it was capable of doing. It changed by receiving attention. The drainage was fixed in 10 days, and the tenant in the North Field, a man named Graves, who had asked about it twice without resolution, came to the castle personally to thank her, and stayed for an hour talking about the land with the specific fluency of someone who had worked it for 30 years, and had opinions that no one had thought to ask for. She asked. He talked. She learned things about the estate that no document had recorded because no document thought to ask the people who knew it best. The schoolroom heating was installed before the weather turned serious. She did not attend the installation herself. She sent Mrs. Crane in a letter. But she went to the village the week after and found that the quality of the information she received in the shop had changed, had the texture now of people talking to someone they'd decided was listening rather than inspecting. Cecily came north in November. It was Vivian who invited her. A letter, direct, without the mediation of the situation's recent history. Come if you want to. There's room. The invitation had the specific quality of an open door that did not require anything of the person standing at it except the decision to walk through. Cecily arrived with 2 trunks and the expression of someone who had been in a house where the air had run out and had stepped outside and was still recalibrating to the existence of oxygen. She was quieter than Vivian remembered. Not the performance of casualness, not the social management, something younger and less finished. She stayed through the winter. They did not become, immediately, the thing that the word sisters implied. They became something more accurate and more durable. 2 women who had lived in the same house for the same 2 years and had each survived it in their different ways, and who were now in the same castle with enough time and enough space to find out what that meant when the structure of the house that had organized them against each other was gone. It meant, gradually, that Cecily told Vivian things she hadn't told anyone, about what it had been like to watch, at 15 and 16, the architecture of her mother's designs, and to understand some of it and be unable to name it to anyone, because naming it meant naming her mother. About the night Harriet had brought her the document for Vivian's father to sign and asked her to leave the room, and Cecily had gone to her maid and said go, and given her the money for the coach, and gone to bed and been awake until 4 in the morning, wondering whether it would arrive in time. Vivian listened to this with the full attention she brought to primary sources. She said, "You did the thing you could do with what you had and the time you had." Cecily was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't enough." "It was part of enough," Vivian said. "That's different." Harriet's case proceeded through the winter and into the spring with the specific pace of legal processes, slow, methodical, building its documentation with the same patience that the original scheme had required. The Carver enterprise collapsed in February, as anticipated, and the financial exposure was what Alaric had projected, and Vivian's father lost what he had invested, which was not everything but was a significant diminishment of what remained. She went to see him in March, not to resolve everything, she'd told herself and him, that resolution was a structure and structures took time to build. But because he was her father, and he was in the specific state of a man who has had the scaffolding of his self-deception removed and is standing in the wreckage of what was under it, and because she understood that state and knew it didn't require rescue so much as company, she sat with him in the library of the Ashford house. Reduced now, Harriet's effects removed, the rooms with the quality of spaces being slowly returned to their original use, and they talked about her mother. Not carefully, not with the management of grief that they'd both been performing since the funeral. The actual thing, the memories with texture to them, the specific and ordinary details of a person that you only held on to if you'd loved them. He cried. She held his hand. She didn't cry, which was not because she felt less, but because she'd already done that, in the early morning, on the grounds of Blackthorn, with no one watching, and had let it arrive and had held it, and had let it settle into the place where it would live from now on, present, permanent, not managed away, but integrated into the structure of the person she was. She went home to Blackthorn. The word arrived without the slightest hesitation. Home. On a Sunday in late March, she was in the library. Her library, the one with Middlemarch and the natural history volumes and the books she'd been adding to the shelves since November. And Alaric came in without knocking, which had become his practice in rooms that had become hers, and sat down in the chair with its back to the wall. He had a letter in his hand. "From Ashworth," he said. "Harriet's final legal strategy has collapsed. Her barrister withdrew from the case last week." She looked up from her book. "It's over." "The criminal referrals are proceeding," he said. "That part is not over. But her capacity to affect your trust, or this estate, or anything connected to us, yes, that's done." She held this. She'd expected to feel something large when the final confirmation arrived. The accumulated weight of 2 years of cold arithmetic and 1 month of evidence building, and a day in a courtroom in London, resolved at last into something that felt like the ending it was. What she felt instead was quiet. The specific quiet of a thing that has been absorbing your structural attention for a long time, and has now resolved, and has left the space it occupied available for other uses. She thought about what she'd said to Cecily. "You do the thing you can do with what you have and the time you have." She thought about this fact that she'd arrived at this castle a month ago as the variable in someone else's calculation, and had spent 30 days assembling the materials to change the outcome of the equation. Her mother's name, 7 years of a forgotten letter, the specific geography of a neglected trust. And that this was not heroic in the way the word heroic implied, not the large dramatic gesture, but the ordinary daily stubborn work of someone who had decided that surviving other people's designs was insufficient and had adjusted accordingly. She thought about how you couldn't know, at the beginning of a thing, whether the floor would hold. You couldn't verify it in advance. You could only put your weight on it and find out. She looked at Alaric. He was watching her with the expression she could read now, had been able to read for weeks, had stopped pretending she couldn't. The one that had been there, in some form, since the room in Thornfield House, when he'd said, "I have known since you were 17 what kind of person you are." "The drainage in the south field," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "What about it?" "Graves mentioned it last week. He says it's been intermittent for 2 years and will become a full problem by next winter if it's not addressed." Alaric considered this. He's probably right. "I want to walk it next week," she said. "The full south boundary. You should come." He looked at her with the expression that was, by now, fully readable. Not the ghost. Not the management layer. The actual thing, which had the texture of something that had been kept very carefully for a very long time, and was being used at last for the purpose it was meant for. "All right," he said. She picked up Middlemarch. He picked up whatever document he'd carried in and never opened. The fire did its ordinary work. The clock measured the afternoon without judgment. Outside, Blackthorn's grounds held their late March quality, the first hesitant green at the edges of the winter brown, the light carrying a warmth it hadn't had in months, the specific condition of a thing that has been cold for a long time and is beginning, slowly, undramatically, to change. The kind of change that didn't announce itself, that happened in the margins of ordinary days, that you only recognized when you looked up from your book at some ordinary afternoon and understood, with the quiet clarity of something that had been true for a while before you named it, that the floor was holding, had been holding, would hold. She looked up from her book. Alaric was reading his document, or pretending to, which she knew the difference between now. His face had the quality it always had in rooms where no one was watching him perform anything, settled, complete, the way a place looked when it had been lived in long enough to stop being arranged and start being inhabited. She thought about a man who had stood in a field with bad drainage at 60 years old and decided the protection was no longer worth the cost. She thought about a girl who had sat in a library at dawn doing cold arithmetic and hadn't known she was doing it toward this specific afternoon, this fire, this man in this chair, this castle with its drainage problems and its village shop and its 20 years of accumulated stories about a duke who'd kept it going alone. She thought about her mother, about 40,000 pounds, about a woman who had built what she could with the time she had and the materials available, and whose daughter had, eventually, found her way to what she'd been protected toward. Not the ending anyone had written for her, the one she'd built from the fragments she'd been left with, in the only direction that made sense when the floor gave way for the last time. Not down, not toward the cold arithmetic of mere survival, but toward the thing on the other side of it. The thing that looked, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon in a library in the north of England, like exactly this. She turned the page. The fire held its warmth. The clock measured on. And outside the window, the grounds of Blackthorn went about the quiet work of becoming what they'd been capable of being all along. Not a cold fortress, not a cursed estate, not a story that society told about a man no one dared approach. Home. Just home.